Hey you guys, welcome to book review number, I believe it's 45 or maybe 46. Yeah. Come ashore and we will kill and eat you all by Christina Thompson. The subtitle is a New Zealand story. So as the subtitle would suggest, this book is about New Zealand. But actually it's kind of passively about New Zealand. Christina Thompson, it's kind of her life story almost, that she tells how, or at least her early life story, she tells how she went to Australia as, I think, a graduate or maybe the college years. And anyway, she met her husband while taking a vacation from Australia in New Zealand, and he happened to be Maori. And this changed her life pretty dramatically. I don't know if she changed her major, but she definitely kind of focused her studies on Maori studies, Maori being the native peoples of New Zealand, who only arrived actually about 600 or 700 years before the first Europeans did. So the Maoris arrived from the rest of Polynesia, from the Great Polynesian migrations in about 1000 AD, 1000 to 1100. And then the first European that arrived was Abel Tasman in 1640. And then the next European that arrived wasn't until James Cook. I believe James Cook was the next explorer that arrived, I think, in the 1760s or 1770s or something like that. But anyway, she kind of talks about the dichotomy of being a Westerner, particularly the colonial view, or the Western view, viewing the Maori versus the Maori themselves. A classic example of that would be a Western's view on environmentalism versus a Maori view on environmentalism. A Western view on environmentalism would be maybe that like trees and animals might have some sort of small humanitarian right, but essentially the reason that we need to save the environment is the effect that it will have upon the greater world. Like if we don't save the environment, then we could die, then the earth declines, then people live lesser lives. But she specifically mentioned that the Maori, these sunglasses are off. The Maori are environmentalists because they view essentially all plant life on a similar plane. Now, this isn't to the degree that, say, like a Buddhist is, where they won't kill anything. The Maori were certainly capable of killing animals for meat as well as, killing others in war. But there was just sort of a sense of equality among all living life, if not necessarily a respect for all living life. She mentions how when the first Europeans came ashore, they were pretty badly treated. Or not badly treated, but I guess there was just large cultural clashes. Like the Maori weren't real timid in, being aggressive towards, Captain Cook and Abel Tasman. Abel Tasman actually losing a number of soldiers when they tried to come ashore in an area that was christened Murderer's Bay. So that was kind of a little interesting thing. I will say a criticism. Where are we at? Only 4 minutes? I will say a criticism I had of this book was it was just, it didn't seem like it seemed like it, for being someone that was a indigenous studies or Maori studies or even Polynesian Islander studies. She didn't really get herself down into the material that much, but actually was a little bit of an ivory tower type. Knowing way more about books about Maori and getting research materials at Brisbane University. Of course, there are no Maori in Australia. Those are the Aborigines. Brisbane University or University of Melbourne, I don't know. Rather than either going to university in New Zealand or really engaging with a native tribe, the tribe being kind of an antiquated word, but just a native group of Maori within the country for an extended period of time, really embedding herself down in there. And really the only instance I thought that the only time that she really did that was through her husband, who she married. She did get to know, her husband's family and got to know their social circumstances, and the fact that they were kind of in the Bay of Islands, which if you look at a map of New Zealand is like, there's that long strand, is like up towards the top of that strand and is known as a very scenic area. Being called the Bay of Islands because it's a very massive bay with a bunch of little tiny islands interspersed all throughout it. And she talked about how, like the Maori were pushed off their land by the, I think it's Paika. That's the Maori word for white settlers or white people. And she talked about, kind of the aunts and uncles and the kind of tumultuous, I can't get that word out. You guys know what I'm talking about. Relationship that their family had, particularly the combination of not real like grinding poverty, but just sort of like diminished economic circumstances or even diminished economic opportunities compared to white people within New Zealand. That combined with the large families that her extended family had. I think they said that her mother had 10 kids, all of who her grandmother, her mother-in-law, her husband's mother. Yeah, so her mother-in-law had 10 children, and the next door neighbor had 10 children, I think like 6 or 7 of whom survived to adulthood. And it was just kind of a madhouse a lot of times with all these people. But she also mentioned how strong the bonds were. And she actually mentioned something interesting about Kant. Kant said, which of course, pulling Kant out of nowhere, which I was kind of critical of. Kant, the philosopher who said that knowledge and time and material, I think, are the 3 elements that make up of all the world, or all of existence, I guess you'd say. But she said that if Kant had been Maori, he probably would have included family relations in there, just because of how deeply embedded family relations are. Now that's good and everything, but maybe there is something to be said about the West, where children get pushed out of the house and kind of have to make their way, and it forces, I guess you'd say, more economic, not opportunity, but just kind of, greater economic circumstances if people are kind of forced to be individuals instead of just be kind of part of a unit that they know they might not become rich, but they'll be taken care of. There's like less incentive, which is also kind of, she talks extensively about stereotypes. And one of the things that I kind of am critical about the book is that she tends to be elevated enough to go beyond like immediate stereotypes. Like she just doesn't say stereotypes, but then she says sort of like, well, if it's not stereotype A, then it's kind of like B. rather than really giving credit for people for who they are, or just kind of, even if the stereotype is somewhat true, kind of phrasing it more as a trend rather than a projection upon a people, which, even though her husband is Maori, I think she does. Probably not with a lot of malice, but just kind of is a tendency within the book that I was kind of critical of. But she talks about and debunks and confirms to the degree that it is appropriate, though, like I said, not as much as I kind of liked it. Some of the stereotypes out there, like the Maori are all war crazy. The Maori are very lazy in sports or competitive pursuits. Not really economically strident, which I think I find kind of funny, because you want to talk about groups of people. The Maori actually are one of the stronger minority groups, really, in most countries. Generally, they make, I think, like 30% or maybe even 20% less than white people within New Zealand, but they're definitely a strong political force, much stronger than the Aborigines within Australia or the Native Americans within the United States. Matter of fact, they even have sort of, I think, kind of like separate representation specifically going to the New Zealand Parliament. This was not in the book, but specifically going to the New Zealand Parliament. So not just like a separate reservation nation, but actual power within the New Zealand government itself, specifically reserved for Maori representatives, which some might say is kind of limiting, because if you want to make them a greater part of the society, but then again, they are the native peoples of the country, so maybe they should have separate elevated rights set aside for them, not necessarily just because they're oppressed, but because they really do represent a lineage that goes beyond just white settlement. Speaking of that lineage, I guess a couple other things. She talks about the gun wars. What were they called? No, not the land wars, plantation wars. I can't really remember. Look it up, kids. But what it was the how essentially the Maoris had no long-range weapons before Europeans arrived, so it was all more or less hand-to-hand. They didn't even really throw spears all that much. It was more thrusting with spears, bashing with a lot of clubs, axes, that kind of thing. So when the first tribes were traded guns, they immediately overran huge chunks of the country, killing off all their rivals. New Zealand was not a unified, by any means, clan or country at the time. There were many, many clans all over the place. But the first clan that got guns just essentially ran wild and killed, and even to the point of like genocide, along with all the disease that the white man brought, particularly like tuberculosis and typhoid fever, stuff like that. I don't think malaria. It's too far south to be a malaria area. But anyway, this tribe killed them all off, and then the white settlers were shortly behind them after there were these huge declines in population taking over the land. And she actually compares this in the last, I'd probably say 1/10 of the book, maybe 1/7 of the book, to the way it happened in Minnesota with some of her relatives. And actually I was a little bit critical of that, just because I felt it's a little self-indulgent to be necessarily compare your white ancestors to the Maori. And I mean, I know it's important and it's something you'll do naturally in the course of your relationship, if you're in an interracial relationship like that. But it was a little self-indulgent for actually asking the reader to engage in a book. I felt it should have just been much more focused on Seven, with it's actually his name, the husband, his clan, and the situation on the ground in New Zealand, rather than kind of all these various blips and blaps all over the place. Another example of that is she talks pretty extensively about like house hunting in Australia and moving around, and for a while they lived in Hawaii, and it was just kind of, I won't say necessarily real focused. She always kind of brought it around to her family and how that reminded her of various Maori situations she had read about in books, or the circumstances she had seen with her husband or her husband's family or things like that. But it just wasn't real, focused on New Zealand and the Maori. The subtitle is A New Zealand Story, but really most of the story is a Australian story or a Hawaii story, talking secondhand about a New Zealand story. So, it's a little critical of that. But anyway, I will say it was kind of good in that it was eccentric, and it wasn't just a historical piece. She did cover her kind of circumstances while also covering a significant part of the history too, which I thought made it more engaging to a certain type of reader. I can definitely read a history book forever about the history of New Zealand, but not everyone likes, what warship happened upon some harbor, 200 years ago. So, in any case, come on shore and we will kill you and eat you all, by Christina, Thompson. All right, you guys, check in for more reviews later. I'll see you.